What the hell was that?
That was the ending of Independence Day. The movie you have to watch every 4th of July.
And the end of Randy Quaid's career.
Yeah, that was pretty much the last thing he did.
That's the last thing to do. That didn't go bad.
Well, this is July, but it's certainly not the 4th of July. Welcome back to UFO Wednesday. Now, just so everybody knows, there are going to be some changes with things starting next Wednesday. The UFO show will next week start at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, whatever the hell Central Time is, and we're gonna have some changes there. The Dangerous Military Nerd Show will be in the morning, and Gary will be taking that over. He's going to be handling that solely. Over time, I will probably make guest appearances, but he's handling the whole situation. So, Gary, do you got anything you want to say?
Nope. Just yay.
That's the name of that tune.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So this week, we're going to be talking about an infamous and unfortunately very little known episode in UFO history, going back over the last 3 decades or so. And it should scare hell out of you. It should, because the implications of what this was all about are astounding. But it's the case of civilian scientist Paul Bennewitz. So what Gary, what did you want to chat
the one
about?
who told me about this, and I want to learn the whole story about this guy. I've never heard of this guy until you mentioned it.
Well, this is a story that has implications running through the United States military, the United States intelligence services, illegalities that run up and down the flagpole. A man was deliberately and targeted by the forces of the American government to basically mentally break him down to the point where he ended up in a psychiatric hospital. Okay. And ultimately, because of what was done to him, he became in such a fragile state that he eventually died. Now, I knew Paul Bennewitz slightly, okay? I didn't know him well, but I knew him slightly. And what was done to this man is simply unconscionable. Now, first off, who the hell was Paul Bennewitz? Paul Bennewitz was a civilian scientist. He had a business called Thunder Scientific Labs. It was out near the Manzano test range. And Bennewitz had a very deep and abiding interest in the UFO phenomenon. Now, another name that today is virtually unknown, although 25, 30 years ago, he was quite well known, was a man by the name of Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Sprinkle was a psychologist, psychiatrist, and he had been researching at that time, and we're talking about the very, very early 80s, the very, very late 70s, abductions. And this was even before abduction researcher Bud Hopkins came onto the scene. All right. And these cases, in fact, were happening. And at that time, the question was, well, if something like this happened to you, what the hell could you do about it? Well, in the case of a woman and her small child up around Wyoming, she claimed an abduction event. She was out one evening driving with her child when they encountered a UFO that landed, and then the weirdness started. Now, this lady, after it was all over, was totally just flabbergasted, gobsmacked. All right. She started doing a little research. She discovered MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and she got in touch with them, who then put her in touch with Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Sprinkle, this was one of the cases that fascinated him, okay? And he happened to be friends with Paul Bennewitz. Bennewitz then became involved with this case. And Bennewitz, while living and working out near the Manzano test range, as I said, had a deep abiding interest in the UFO situation, and he began seeing some things that he couldn't explain. Now, this is going to get much, much more involved as we go down the road. But Paul Bennewitz became convinced that this woman and her child, in fact, were abducted and examined and tested on by extraterrestrials. Now, at that time, this was not a well-known phenomenon. It really didn't become basically, so to speak, mainstream until after Bud Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs took a stroll down Main Street with this topic. Now, Bennewitz, as time went on, was seeing things out near the Air Force Air Base, near the Manzano weapons range, that he couldn't explain. He became convinced that for whatever reason, extraterrestrials and the UFO phenomenon was taking an inordinate amount of interest in this area and might even have, for God's sake, an underground facility there where they were basically operating out of, the UFOs, the aliens. Well, Paul began doing some real in-depth research. He was also very adept at computers, and he began dinking around with his computers, thinking that he could, in fact, be able to intercept extraterrestrial signals. Now, he then saw something that flabbergasted him out on the Manzano weapons range. And he was convinced by God they were alien. So he contacted the Air Force, okay, told them what he observed, and unbeknownst to Paul, what he really tapped into, and he didn't know it at the time, was some ultra top secret research that the Air Force was conducting. Well, they figured that out pretty quickly, and they decided, well, we got to get this guy uninvolved with this business, because this is certainly not any thing for a civilian to be involved with. So they tried to warn him off. And unfortunately, Bennewitz, who was a very stubborn individual, wouldn't be warned off. Okay. Then he really began making a lot of noise. He went to his United States senator, federal senator, okay, and basically laid it all out to him, trying to get some congressional interest in this. Now, there were a lot of things happening then, okay? None of this happens on an isolated island, so to speak, metaphor. There were animal mutilations happening then, willy-nilly across the entire western United States. Mutilations were happening in New Mexico, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon, okay? And U.S. Senator Harrison Schmitt was trying to get federal involvement in, had gone to the FBI about this. All of this was swirling about in this mix. The FBI, incidentally, refused to do anything with this, claimed they couldn't prove that it crossed state lines, even though all these various states were suffering the same agricultural series of crimes with animal mutilations. All right. And then here comes Bennewitz kicking up a fuss. Well, somebody decided to stick the AFOSI on him. The Air Force Office of Scientific Special Intelligence. Thank you, Vic. My wife over here, who was the former. Yes, Special Investigations. Sometimes I get running here, my mouth outruns my mind.
So Vicky's correcting you. Gotcha.
Yes, she is. Vicky is correcting me. Yes, she is. Well, that's why I keep her around. Keeps me honest. Well, at any rate, this was happening. There was another name that popped into the mix at this time. And that name was William Moore, Bill Moore. Now, Bill Moore, back in 1979, wrote a book about, and this was incidentally the very first book about the Roswell incident. This book at the time was basically a blockbuster. By that time, in the early 80s, nobody knew about Roswell. Or if they did, that went out of their mind 30, 40 years before. And suddenly, here was a book that was describing an alleged incident where 2 years immediately following the end of the Second World War, an object of unknown origin, extremely advanced, had crashed outside of what was then the only singular, nowhere else on the planet, military installation with the means and the capability of deploying nuclear weapons anywhere on the planet. The 509th Bomb Wing. Still, at that point, the Army Air Force, not the U.S. Air Force. They weren't around yet. And in this situation, okay, at the time, which caused a worldwide sensation for a few days, all right, until it all went away. Moore, who had been at that point a UFO researcher but not well known, was a member of APRO. APRO was a civilian organization, actually the very first, which had been basically created in 1952, just about this time in July, because if you know your UFO history, you will know that almost 70 years ago, right now, Washington, D.C. was invaded on 2 different weekends by UFOs that basically came in, overflew the nation's capital in every restricted airspace you could imagine, including the White House, the Congress, the Pentagon. And then, to top it all off, and this is not well known today, there was a 3rd weekend when this happened. Now that scared the shit out of somebody in government. Well, Moore, with the release of his book, okay, and his connection, he was a member of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which were begun by a husband and wife team by the name of James, Jim, and Coral Lorenzen, okay, who at that point in time, Jim and Coral were widely known. They were not only the leading members of APRO, they had written numerous books about the UFO phenomenon. And this is another little known fact, especially today. At that point, except for NICAB, which was a National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, which basically for years had been run by Major Donald Kehoe, Marine Corps, USMC, retired. And incidentally, Kehoe had been a pilot. All right. That was it when it came to civilian research. Well, some of the members of APRO, this is just an aside, had decided to start their own UFO organization. And one of those guys was a guy by the name of Walt Andrus. All right. Well, Andrus basically went in to the APRO files, raided them, raided the name list of members of APRO, and then he and several other fellows basically created the Mutual UFO Network organization. Okay. Now, Coral Lorenzen, all right, was a fiery lady. All right, had a reputation. She was a lady you did not want to cross ever, because not only would she never forgive you, but she would never forget. And until her dying day, if she would have been walking out in the Sahara Desert with Walt Andrus and he suddenly self-combusted into flames, not a drop of water in 1,000 miles in any direction, Coral Lorenzen would not have pissed on Walt to put the fire out. So that's what you were dealing with there. Okay. So anyway, to get back to the story. So Bill Moore, who wrote the first Roswell book, had been a member of APRO, still at that point was a member of APRO, was covertly approached by government assets, in essence, all right, intelligence agents, including the AFOSI, all right. One of the people that had been directed to contact Bill Moore was a guy by the name of Richard Doty. You all recognize that name today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Doty, who at that time was a NCO in AFOSI, all right, has a rich and varied career in disinformation leading through all of the 1980s, including derailing a projected documentary that was being pursued by Linda Moulton Howe with HBO. Okay. I'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But the long and the short of it was, Moore was brought into the fold. Now, over the years, and I'm talking primarily in the 80s and the early 90s, I had a somewhat close association with Bill Moore. I am sure that part of it had to do with Moore being directed by his government handlers to keep an eye on Vicky and I at UFO Magazine, because we were busting some pretty big stories. Now, I knew this at the time. You know, I had been involved in military intelligence in the Army in Vietnam. That's a lot of what I did were intelligence things. So I knew how the object, the situation worked. All right. And we were being surveilled. I caught people surveilling us outside of our home. Okay. Yeah. Honey, I'm on the radio. Well, Richard was the one that brought it to our attention. Sorry about that. Vicky sometimes Vicky sometimes forgets. But at any rate, we were being surveilled. I knew that. Okay. And to be honest with you, at the time, I didn't really give a damn. Okay. What were they going to do? All right. If you get right down to it, I had been at that time, I was not too long out of law enforcement. I knew exactly how that worked, and I could handle myself. So we went moving along. But on the other side of the coin, I wanted to keep an eye on Bill Moore because of something that happened that I'll be discussing here in a few minutes that took place in July of 1989 in Las Vegas, Nevada, at the International MUFON Symposium. So, along about this time, I had my first encounter with Mr. John Lear. Now, John Lear was the son of William Lear of Lear Jet Corporation and Lear Sigler Corporation, the guys that basically made the Lear jet. John had been a pilot and was at that time a pilot himself. John had flown for a contract airline in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Not Air America.
Oh.
Not Air America. Continental Air was the name of the group. So, the reason I got in touch initially with John Lear was in 1987, all right, I had been medically retired from the police department for just a titch over a year. I had gone through a divorce, all right, and I was banging around in my townhouse. I was going back to college. I was taking some computer courses, and I bought my very first computer system in November, December of 1987. It was a Tandy Radio Shack computer, a 1000EX, and I tricked it out with everything that was available that you could add to it then. I mean, by today's standards, that computer was pathetic, but my God, it opened up doors for me I never knew existed. And then I compiled my mistake by adding a modem to it. By the way, I might add a 300 baud modem. Now, Gary, you probably know what that is, but do the rest of you guys know?
Oh, yeah, I definitely know.
Of course we know.
Yeah,
Okay.
these guys know.
All right. Well, you know, a lot of people today don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. They hear modem. What the fuck is a modem? Well, a modem.
I remember the wonderful sounds they made.
Yeah. Modem was what you used to hook your telephone up to your computer, which then could take you on the very, very nascent internet. All right. And except for bulletin board services, BBSs, which incidentally I had one later on, there were only a very, very few places you could go, including pay services like CompuServe and America Online, which came along, and several others, okay, that hell, I even forget what the hell they were called now. But I ended up going on CompuServe. Now, with a 300 baud modem, all right, which I had, that was the slowest speed that you could achieve and be online, all right? I could literally, if I went online with that, I could watch on my monochrome screen, okay, the pixels being painted as this thing connected. Well, be that as it may, it got me on CompuServe. And I discovered a place called the Issues Forum. And on there, they were talking about things like UFOs, cattle mutilations, etc. And boom, the light went on in my head. Because as a criminal investigator, I had investigated back in 81, 82, 2 cattle mutilations. All right. That's a story in itself. But suddenly I got galvanized. What in the hell is all this going on here? Okay. Now, obviously, I knew about UFOs, had never really given it in years a lot of thought. All right. But suddenly they were all around me, so to speak. So one of the system administrators on the Issues Forum was a guy by the name of Jim Spicer from Fountain Hills, Arizona. And I ended up making his acquaintance, and I discovered that along with this thing on CompuServe, he had a BBS system that was basically growing by leaps and bounds, literally around the world, with other nodes joining his system. And his system was called Paranet. Now, Paranet basically was a system geared toward all that weird phenomenon like cryptozoology, UFOs, cattle mutilations, and other assorted oddities. Well, Spicer and I ended up becoming friends. And one day, I'm on CompuServe at $6.40 an hour. Incidentally, I might add, at 300 baud. And there is this paper that had just been uploaded by a guy by the name of John Lear, whom Jim Spicer, knew. As it turned out, back in 87, all right, at the then Mutual UFO Symposium that was held in around Washington, D.C., Lear showed up there, which really galvanized, the entire audience. Because here was a guy who was a celebrated, highly decorated pilot that came from basically, by American standards, royalty, his old man being William Lear, all right, of Learjet fame. And incidentally, if you know anything about UFO history, you will know that back in the 50s and early 60s, Bill Lear, William Lear, John Lear's father, had a very deep covert interest in the UFO phenomenon at that time. Well, Lear had been friends in Southeast Asia with a bunch of pilots from an organization called the Ravens Air Force, And these guys flew a lot of covert, highly classified missions, doing all kinds of nasty stuff they probably couldn't talk about in polite society. And anyway, Lear ran into one of these guys and said, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. This is later what Lear told me. This guy told him, hey, did you hear about that thing that happened in the UK? And he said, what thing? Well, at Bentwaters. Bentwaters? No. Well, a UFO landed there around Christmas time of 80, and it wasn't bullshit. And Lear said, are you serious? Well, today we all know what that is, okay? But at that time, like everything else in this field, was highly secret. So Lear starts digging around in the UFO field. Somewhere along the line, he encounters Paul Bennewitz. Bennewitz and Lear become buddies. And there were many others that ended up in the mix. But by this time, Bennewitz, who was being basically played like a finely tuned Stradivarius violin by the AFOSI, okay, is starting to become basically unglued. What do I mean by that? Well, they had begun feeding Paul all kinds of disinformation. And some of the names that were reportedly involved in this will shock you, or should shock you. Okay? Bennewitz was being fed a story of evil aliens that had basically taken up residence in the Dulce, New Mexico area in an underground facility, and basically were working against the forces of the United States government. One of the tales that Paul Bennewitz had been told involved a joint facility underground that were being maintained by not only extraterrestrials, but members of the United States military, Special Operations Command, and that the so-called deal, all right, that had been worked out between the aliens and the military involved allowing the aliens by our government to abduct people for experimentation, to mutilate cattle for whatever reason they were mutilating cattle. And it was being done hand in glove in exchange for the aliens giving us access to high technology. Now, guys, I got to stop for a second here.
Oh, this would be a great moment for Martin to give Darius his thank you.
Yes.
Martin, give him his thank you for his $4. And I'm assuming that included
I don't want
chair
to.
with a cup of coffee.
No, I don't want to.
Please, I
No.
beg of you, give him a thank you video.
Okay. Here we go.
Where do they teach you to talk like this? In some Panama City sailor want a hump bar? Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
Where do they teach people like you to talk like that? And some Panamanian sailor want a hump bar? That's one of my favorite lines of all time.
Yeah.
All right, Don, you ready to finish it? This is like an amazing lesson right now. This is fascinating story, dude. I shit you not. I never even heard of this guy, and this is horrifying because what they're doing to him is what the media and the government have been doing to society for 75 years.
Oh, it gets.
But they're doing it intensely.
It gets worse.
Oh my God! Please continue. This is amazing.
So the whole thing that brought me to John Lear and ultimately then out into the wild, so to speak, was a paper that Lear wrote. Now, I was a detective, okay? And at that time, I didn't have a lot of areas I could go to. I didn't know a lot of people that I could talk to until later, because obviously I wanted to get to the bottom of this. Now, investigations can be a very long and very tedious thing. Not only gathering the information, but then sitting down and trying to make sense out of it. Do you follow me? Do you follow me so far?
Yeah.
So I read this document that John Lear wrote that he gave to Jim Spicer at Paranet, who subsequently then went around the world, okay, through all the Paranet nodes. And at that time, there were a lot, and a lot more were on the wings. Paranet was in the UK, was in France, was in Germany, was in Russia, was in Japan, Korea, Australia, and probably, excuse me, probably China. And then on CompuServe. Well, in this document, Lear, and you can incidentally, you can find it still to this day. If you go on the internet, pop into your search engine, the John Lear document or John Lear paper, and then you can read it. But having read this, all right, Lear alleged that the upper echelon, so to speak, what we today probably would call the swamp, all right, unbeknownst to Congress, had entered into an illegal treaty with these aliens that in an exchange for technology, we allowed or are allowing the ETs to abduct people, mutilate animals, and what have you. And at that time, the first drum beats were being made about human alien hybrids being developed. Also, that the aliens were inserting devices into the human beings that they were basically abducting. And at that time, now remember, this is 87, 88, Lear was maintaining that in 3 to 5 years, these people would be, quote unquote, activated by the aliens for reasons or purposes at that point unknown. That also, and this incidentally, looking at it in hindsight, was the first inclination of what was coming with Bob Lazar. All right. Now, at that time, Lazar was living in Las Vegas. Lazar, we will all remember, is purported to be a civilian scientist that was hired by EG&G Corporation in Vegas to be taken out to Area 51 to work on recovered alien technology. Now, I don't got to go into the Lazar story, But this was the first glimmerings of Lazar, because if you know anything about the Lazar story, you will know that among other things, Lazar allegedly was briefed by his handlers of some of the technology the aliens supposedly brought, which included a device which enabled the viewer to look back through time. And some of the things that Lear was talking about in this document involved watching the crucifixion of Christ. Okay, now, some of this stuff Lear screwed up. He got some of his facts wrong about some of these things he was talking about. But that being said, the document in itself was shocking, because one of the things that Lear maintained was that the aliens were using some human beings for nourishment.
Dude.
The evil aliens were basically eating some people. Now, not like you and I would
like
eat
Twilight Zone episode. It's a cookbook.
Yeah.
To serve man.
Yes. Yes.
Crazy.
But they were basically dissolving people and then using the solution, okay, which was being absorbed through the alien skin. Oh, it was a mishmash. Well, when I read that, I'll never forget my reaction. I was, in many ways, excuse me, outraged by it. So I got in touch with Spicer and said, is this guy basically being chased by men in white coats with butterfly nets? And he said, no. He said, I got to tell you, he said, I think a lot of this is crap, but it's interesting to say the least. And I said, man, I got to talk to him. Give me his phone number. So he did. And I called John up. And we had about a 3-hour chat on the phone. At the time, I was in Idaho. Lear, of course, was in Las Vegas. And we talked. And he told me a lot of stuff that at the time I had no way of verifying, but I was making notes, okay. And one of the things he told me was about the government developing some extraordinarily powerful bunker busters. And I said, for what? He said, well, to root the aliens out of their underground facilities, if in fact it goes that way. Well, actually, what he was talking about became the basis also for Bob Lazar, because this was some of the stuff that Lazar, through his quote-unquote government connections, had come up with. Now, it's more involved than that, but that's just the surface, okay? So, about a week later, I had been at school, taking my classes, and I'm home, and there's a knock at the door. I go to the door, and it was UPS. I hadn't ordered anything. And this guy hands me this damn package that had to weigh over 10 pounds. And I took it, didn't have a clue where this came from. looked at it, and it was from John Lear. So I took it in, opened it up. There were a couple of videotapes in there. There was reams of paper. I mean, it had to cost him a freaking fortune to duplicate a lot of what he was, his research was, but he freaking sent it to me. Well, I got to tell you, that impressed the hell out of me. Okay? That couldn't have been cheap. So I start jumping through this. And suddenly, I'm in the middle of this whole, I was consumed by this whole UFO thing. Well, we're almost at the break time, aren't we?
We are how many minutes away?
Couple of minutes.
Yeah, we're a couple of minutes.
1
away.
minute.
Well, I'm gonna stop here for now because I don't want to get into something juicy and then have to quit. So why don't we just
let's see.
just
Do we have any
chit-chat?
comments in the chat that we want to feature, Martin? Manager of the chat?
Not really. We have been.
Just a lot of stupid
Answering.
shit, typical Bush McFadden stuff.
Oh, you're just jealous because never.
Bush knows I love him.
We do need to give Darius his video.
Yeah,
Oh,
you played
we
a
did?
video for him.
Oh,
Yeah,
I did.
okay. I was away. Sorry, I had to use the
that's
facilities.
okay. But here, I know Bush wants this one.
Ma, I'm doing a show.
And
Those sons of bitches.
has Zach shown up yet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hey, fuck you, Kyle.
now it's a show. I just feel like my brain is spinning from all this information, Don. I got to tell you,
Huh.
it's like it's all going into my head, but it's like there's just it's so convoluted, the entire situation. How do you keep all that together?
I'm the Don.
Oh,
Yeah, we got a break.
we need to go. We need to go to break.
All right, we'll be right
Just
back
turn
after
on
this message, guys.
Hi guys, this is Gary from Pop Culture Minefield here on KGRA, and we're leaving for our first break. I hope we survive.
Did you know 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated? If you struggle with focus, run low on energy, or when it's time to finally sleep, you simply can't, this can all be linked to dehydration, and Fuel Up has the answer. Our proprietary formula contains the finest cellular hydration with the strongest immune-enhancing natural ingredients. The Fuel Up system is made up of 3 different incredibly tasting varieties. Wake kickstarts your day with a jolt of caffeine. Play boosts focus while hydrating your cells. Rest not only helps you relax, but also rejuvenates your cells while you sleep. Here's what our clients have to say.
I really don't miss my coffee, and you can tell the difference.
So I'm gonna take it for the energy. I'm gonna take it for the play. I'm gonna take it, all day.
And it works. That's the thing. It works. We love it.
Take the Fuel Up Challenge now, where we offer a Feel the Difference money-back guarantee. Fuel Up for life.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Oh wow, we survived. Welcome back to the commercial break. Now for some more Pop Culture Minefield on KGRA.
Biggity boo. All right, Don.
I don't know if you guys realize this, but this, in effect, is a PhD course in ufology.
It is. I feel like I'm sitting in on a lecture for a class that I actually signed up and wanted to go to.
Because this was the gateway to so much. All right. Now, I haven't even finished with Bennewitz yet, but there were so many things happening in the field. I mean, looking at it in retrospect, well, it basically makes my mind go all flutter. There were the Bentwaters Woolbridge case was just becoming known. All right. Barry Greenwood and Larry, God, what was Larry's last name? Wrote a book that was all based on military encounters, including nuclear weapons incursions by UFOs in the Montanas. All right. Now, it ended up Bentwaters was a nuclear incident because whether you are aware of it or not, at that time, 1980, Eastern Europe, which was still under the control of the Soviet Union, Poland was in the middle of basically a revolution. Lech Walesa, you remember that name?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Who was running the unions there. They were basically rebelling against the Russians. If you know anything about your history anyway, you will know back in 1956 what happened in Hungary, okay, when they tried to throw off the yoke of the Russians sent in their tanks and basically overran the damn country. Well, it was feared that that was going to happen in Poland, which could have ignited ultimately World War III. Bentwaters was a storage depot for tactical nuclear weapons, okay? Tactical nukes, which could, not strategic, not the huge ones, but the ones that could wipe out a column of tanks, that kind of thing, and A-10 Warthogs, tank busters, tank killers, all right? There was a fear that Soviet Spetsnaz, that's their special forces, might have run a preemptive raid in Bentwaters, okay, to neutralize those nukes. Nobody really knew, all right, what the hell was going on. And suddenly, this UFO showed up. We know it was there. The deputy base commander, basically, we've got recordings of him out in the woods with some of his troops looking for this damn thing, okay? It was crazy. It was nuts, all right? Then there was a special run, a news special with the guy I knew, Chuck DeCaro, all right, which was around, oh, hell, I forget now, 84, 85 on CNN about that case. Then in 86, a Japanese airliner above Alaska who was carrying a buttload of wine, incidentally, my favorite wine, Beaujolais, from France, okay, to the Far East. They were flying through. He encountered a UFO in the skies above Alaska, okay, with a UFO that was described as large, if not larger, than a U.S. aircraft carrier. Incidentally, picked up on radar. That's another whole story, okay, of not only it being verified that something was there, but that at the time, President Reagan's science advisor was involved in the mix about this thing. Then something happened in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Gulf Breeze became another hot spot for UFOs. All this is happening within a couple of years of each other, along with the Paul Bennewitz situation. And we get to 1989, July 89, the International MUFON Symposium. Now, one of the speakers was going to be Bill Moore. Bill Moore of the Roswell Incident book. Bill Moore, an investigator for APRO. And Bill Moore, at that point, unknown as basically a military intelligence asset. Now, Bennewitz, by this time, was rock, rattling, and rolling. All right. One of the things that Moore's handlers instructed him to do was to give a document to Paul Bennewitz that was completely fraudulent. Now, later on, I confronted Bill Moore about this, and he vehemently denied any part of it except to the point where he claimed he cautioned Paul to not accept this thing at face value. Matter of fact, I got a radio show sitting here where I interviewed Moore in '94 about this. But let's not get sidetracked. So Moore basically is going to give his lecture. Now, as an aside, at that point, John Lear had been appointed the state director for the state of Nevada by MUFON, Walt Andrus, the international director. All right. They basically wanted to play off of Lear's notoriety with MUFON. They're always looking for more and more members. So probably a month, which would have been June, I guess, late May, early June, I get a phone call one day up in Idaho, and it's John Lear, and he said, Don, he said, I understand you've been basically investigating some pretty weird shit up there. What he was talking about was I had been confronted with what appeared to be some mutilations. Okay, now remember, as a cop, I had investigated 2 mutilations back in the early 80s. But then I was put onto what purportedly had been some mutilations involving human beings. Human mutilations. And among the people that I had talked to was John Keel, okay, a rather famous researcher who, among other works, had written a book later made into a movie called The Mothman Prophecies. Now, John, okay, it's a long story. I don't want to go off into the weeds, but basically, I had called John because of one of John's theories involving his research involving the so-called men in black. John Keel had told me at one point, which I knew for a fact, that the UFO phenomenon always seemed to have an inordinate amount of interest in blood, human blood. Okay? As a matter of fact, during his infamous West Virginia research, which led to the Mothman prophecies, at one point, he was aware of a UFO's attempt to abduct a Red Cross bloodmobile. Now think about that. So I called him up and I said, John, I said, look, you've got this theory about the MIB, the Men in Black, one of them being that they are basically manufactured or created entities using blood and flesh and what have you. And you know, hey, if you have done any research into MIB cases, you will know how freaking weird they are anyway. Okay, and what they look like. I said, well, I've come across several cases that appear to be human mutilations. And I told him what I had turned up by then. And he said, yeah. And then he told me about a case where a husband and wife, Americans, had been down in Mexico, okay, on a vacation. And they were coming back up to the States. They were going to cross back into Texas. And as they're driving down the highway, suddenly, out of a clear blue sky, well, a freaking nude body dropped from the sky that was separated in two, cut in half. Now, you can't make this shit up. So I took that under my advisement. So I've been working on this human mutilation thing. So Lear wanted to know if I would be willing on Sunday at the Mutual UFO Network Symposium, if I would give a paper on what I had uncovered up to that point. And I said, yeah, sure. Now, some more inside baseball information. MUFON at that time, the board members were stiff, to coin a phrase or a metaphor, okay. They were like the Puritan leadership. UFOs in the sky was okay, and every once in a while a UFO landed. Well, they could accept that. But then when you get into the weirder shit, like abductions and all this other stuff, mutilations, oh my God, okay, that was a bridge too far. So I tell Lear, yeah, well, I'll think about it. And yeah. And then he told me that I could make some money from it. And I was like, oh, hell yeah. Okay. Because I was a poor college student at the time, right? So I plan to do that. Well, he starts putting out the word, and there were some other things there too. And several other speakers on Sunday, which I might add were not approved by the MUFON board, okay, were controversial to say the least. And mine was very controversial, my talk. So I fly down to Vegas. All right. I go to the hotel. I think it was at the time. I think it was the Aladdin. I walk in there, and I got my luggage. I got my laptop computer, and I'm walking up to the desk. And I walk up. I see the guy there at the desk, and I set everything down. And off to my side are three guys, and they're eyeballing me the whole way up there. So, hey, Vegas is spook central. Who knows? The freaking Air Force got a huge giant base right there. Fucking Russian spies running around. I'm not shitting you, really. Okay. All kinds of stuff. Area 51, you name it. By this time, everybody knows about Bob Lazar. Secret testing out there in the Groom Mountains, all kinds of shit. So I have no idea who these guys are. And suddenly this little short guy, older, okay, he must have been in his 60s or maybe even older, walks up to me and he said, "Are you Don Ecker?" And I looked down at this little putz, because that's how I'm thinking of him. Just real friendly son of a bitch, aren't you? "Are you Don Ecker?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "I'm Walt Andrus. I'm the international director of MUFON. And I'm here to tell you that if you," I had never talked to this guy before, okay? Never had a goddamn moment with him, nothing. "If you speak at Lear's Sunday situation, I can promise you you'll never speak at another MUFON symposium ever, ever." And I'm looking at this guy, and I am not somebody that handles that kind of an approach very well. All right. There was probably 200 or 300 things I could have said to him, but I didn't. I kept my mouth shut. And I said, "All right, thanks." And I got my key and I went to my room. But I'm thinking to myself, pal, if you fucking think that means shit to me, I am the director of research for UFO Magazine. Who the fuck do you think you are? This is what I'm thinking, right? So I go up to my room. Now, that was a very stressful weekend. Very. And there was a lot happening with Lear. They put, when I say they, I'm talking about MUFON, put a bundle of crap on Lear's shoulders trying to get him to cancel this thing. But one thing about Lear, I'll give him this. Okay, he was one of these guys that might not say a hell of a lot to you, but you ain't going to push him around. So Walt Andrus decides he's going to really lay into him, and Lear said, "Fine." He's a fucking Las Vegas icon, okay? He goes down the strip to another hotel, and he said, "Look," he said, "I've got this thing I want to put on," and he explains the situation. "And I want to rent this hall for these guys to come down and speak on Sunday." "Okay, Mr. Lear, no problem." So Lear goes back, lets Andrus know, and had Lear have done that, okay, that whole symposium would have collapsed like a cheap suit, because that's exactly what happened to Andrus. He collapsed like a cheap suit, and it went on. Now, for example, my talk, all right, the one I gave on Sunday, there were over 800 people in the audience. 800 people, okay, which for something involving UFOs, that's a hell of a lot of people. So, but the night before, that was the nuclear detonation, because that was the night that Bill Moore spoke. And in his, now remember, up to this point, Bill Moore, William Moore, the author of the Roswell incident, all this other crap behind his name, he is one of the, at that time, the most well-known UFO people in the United States, admitted before that huge audience, and I was there, Vicky was there, many, many people were there to hear what he had to say. He admitted to being a government intelligence asset, admitting that he fed Paul Bennewitz government disinformation, which ultimately led Bennewitz to having a complete nervous breakdown. Now think about that. The federal government basically targeted an American citizen because they didn't like what he was doing, and they drove the man into an insane asylum. Now, how many federal statutes and everything else, including Bennewitz's human rights, were violated by that? Nobody ever did one goddamn thing about it. Okay? Nobody was ever called to account. And one of the sons of bitches that was involved up to his freaking eyebrows was Richard fucking Doty. Okay? And I got to tell you, all these years later, almost 35 freaking years later, I'm still steamed about that. All right? But there was more going on. Oh my God, so much more.
Did Lear know about this shit too?
Well, you see, no, he did not. This was one of the things that later I discovered through my research. A lot of John Lear's thesis, his theory about the evil aliens, an alien invasion in essence, okay, came from Paul Bennewitz. And Bennewitz got it from AFOSI and other spooks. Now, I told you some of the names that I was going to mention would shock you. That is, if you're up on your UFO history. J. Allen Hynek was the civilian astronomer consultant to Project Blue Book, going all the way back to the early 50s. All right. J. Allen Hynek, the guy that gave us such stellar little gems like it must have been or could have been swamp gas. Do you remember that? With the Hillsdale sightings in 1966, which at the time, okay, Congressman Jerry Ford, who later became president of the United States because Richard Nixon was forced to resign in 1974, and Nixon's first VP, vice president, was Spiro Agnew, who had to resign because because he was such a crook. Okay.
He really was a fucking criminal.
And then Jerry Ford became the VP, and when when Nixon resigned, he was the pres. Jerry Ford, back in 66 and 67, pushed Congress to hold hearings on UFOs, which they ultimately did, which gave us that bogus bullshit, okay, thing with the Project Blue Book hearings, all right, which was crap. All right, it was bought and paid for by the Air Force from day one. But the Condon Committee, University of Colorado study, all right, which came out in a book. And even when the book was released, at the end of that, all right, even what they talked about in the book, there were over 30% of all the cases examined that were unexplained and unexplainable. But the Air Force claimed there was no threat to national security, which was pure, total bullshit. All right. But they got away with it. And they got away with it basically until, well, around 79, 80, when things started to open up again with UFO situations and cases. But hey, look, there was so much going on in this time period. That time period from about, I'm going to say 84 through almost all of the 90s was the petri dish that gave us what we have today. The internet. Now, at that time, the internet was nascent, all right? But oddities on the web, which today they're everywhere, all right? UFOs, abductions, mutilations, you name it, they're there, okay? All began at this period of time. And, the thing about it, I don't know whether I'm proud of it or I'm cringing inside, but I was there to see most of it happen. And, very weird. In the early 90s at UFO Magazine, we were being basically contacted weekly by every imaginable TV show and series that you can imagine. And I was going on the tube sometimes 2 or 3 days a week. I was going on the tube. The shows that I did, Hard Copy, Larry King Live, I can't even remember a lot of them now. I was on the Mo Gaffney show. I was on what's her face, the chick that gives away cars or used to give away cars.
Oprah.
Oh yeah, Oprah.
You get a car. You get a car.
Even though you had to pay the taxes
on it. You get an anal probe.
But it was some weird stuff. Whoa, Gary, that's about the time you contacted. Well, somewhere in there you contacted me.
Oh, the first time back in 2007.
Was that in 2007? Okay.
Yeah, it was like, because I think you had emailed me, and I can't remember. I know it has to do with Dale Duck, that you and I contacted each other the first time. And I was out for my walk, and I'm like, I'm going to be out here for at least an hour doing my walk. I'm going to call Don, talk to this guy. And it was our first conversation. It was awesome.
What did I want to, do you remember what it was I wanted with Die?
Well, I know that this was in the period of time when I created with Dale, John Del Vecchio, Doug Esposito. We created that company, Charlie Foxtrot Entertainment, and we're going to be doing that. The City of Fire, the story of the battle for Missoula. And I wrote the first draft, and Dale did. It was right in that period, so there was so much going on. And then you messaged me by email, and I got back to you, and I can't remember if you gave me your number or if your number was on your email. If you had like a card, we all put like ID cards with our emails. And I just remember I called you, but I cannot remember what it was. I know it had something to do with Dale. Because that was part of the conversation. Because I think you knew at the time I was working with Dale because there was a press release about it, publicly, about our entire team working together. But God, man, I would give anything to have those brain cells back.
Yeah, well, I lost a shitload of them too with tequila, so I understand that.
Mine was just with stupidity.
Does anybody have any freaking questions or anything?
Well,
I mean, Jesus, I've been talking.
Why did he? What killed Paul Bennewitz? Did he get sick?
Yeah.
Is it possible that they poisoned him or killed him?
Well, he was 75, so.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think
to have done that stuff, and I know their excuse in their minds is they had every right to do what they did because of that law they passed in 1947 that allowed the government to do whatever it thought was necessary, include killing American citizens to keep secrets.
Now, when I was doing Dark Matters Radio on Cyberstation USA, I did that for 5 years, 5 or more years. Okay. For several years, I had a segment I would do every week or every 2 weeks called Tracy Torme's Mad Hollywood Minute. Now, basically what that was a segment where we would take a person that Torme knew, like Gene Roddenberry, Stephen Greer. That was funny. Stephen Greer. Or Bill Moore. Now, Torme knew Bill Moore back in those days very well. And before Moore did that MUFON address, because he lived here in town, he had lunch with Tracy Torme. And now this was something I didn't freaking understand, but he took his speech down to lunch, gave it to Tracy to read, and I don't know if Tracy was high or what, but he read the whole damn thing, and it never connected with him about what Bill Moore was admitting. Now, incidentally, I got to tell you that Moore, when he did that, when he gave that speech and admitted being a government spook, his career was over. Okay? The UFO, I mean, that night when he did that, you would not have believed the reaction from that audience in MUFON. It was damn near chaotic. The closest thing I could think of to compare it to was the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention riots. All right? That's how bad it was. And at the end of his speech, Moore literally ran out of the room, didn't take one question, got on his motorcycle, and split back to LA. He was a big biker, okay? Big biker. And it left the whole place in turmoil. So basically, if he didn't know, and I always said, hell, I told him to his face, Bill, you're one arrogant son of a bitch. Okay? And he was arrogant, but he thought he could weather it. And unfortunately for him, he never did. But the bottom line was that was definitely a turning point in the UFO research community. That was a turning point. And things were never quite the same after that. He had been teamed up with another guy, Moorhead, by the name of Jamie Chandra. All right. At that time, they were closely connected. It was Moore and Jamie Chandra, who gave us MJ-12. Are you familiar with MJ-12?
Mm-hmm.
Majestic 12.
The Majestic 12, yeah.
Yes. And it's that is basis for another entire show, the whole MJ-12 fiasco.
Let's talk about names. That next week. That'll be another PhD level lecture.
Yeah. Well, I have to brush up on MJ-12 because once again, the names that were involved in that. But to get back to this topic, two names that Moore told me face to face on radio that were involved in the disinforming of Paul Bennewitz, that had foreknowledge before the act of what they were doing, were J. Allen Hynek, who gave, how do I say this, a doctored computer to Paul Bennewitz, and Jacques Vallée. Okay. Jacques Vallée, an infamous, famous name in UFO research, highly regarded, a Frenchman who's been living over here for 50 years now or more. The guy in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in the movie, the French researcher, was modeled after Jacques Vallée. Moore claimed that they were both feeding information back to the United States Air Force. I challenged him on the spot. I said, wait a minute, Bill. Whoa, wait. You're making a heck of an allegation there. Can you prove it? I can prove it. And I asked him, do you have the proof with you now? No. And I said, when can you have it to me? I can get it to you before the end of the week. And guys, that was in 1994, and I'm still waiting for it. That was the last time I ever had any connection or contact with Bill Moore since that point. So there you go.
And I mean, when you say you've had no further contact, that was a choice, right? You just wanted nothing more.
No. He avoided me like I had smallpox. I don't shy away from that stuff, man. You ought to know me well enough to know that.
No, I also know that when somebody pisses you off, you hold on to that. It's like, so I just was curious if it was you or him. So it's him. He's a coward piece of shit.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in the immortal words of me, fuck that guy.
Yeah. Really. No, he disappeared. He went deep underground.
Now I'm curious
last
because you brought
I
up
heard.
Torme. What is he really got a show, or what's going on with you?
I don't know.
I'm going to reach out to him. Because if he's got his internet problem fixed, I'd like to have him back. He's a lot of fun. And, not to mention I'm a big fan of his work. But his internet was so bad that you just can't have him on because it's just, oh my God, it's just the interruptions are so bad. Boy, if he got that resolved, it would be great. But
he's got, the lady that was allegedly, supposedly, I was told, this is weeks ago now, that he called me up, Tracy called me up, and he told me he had a show, and he wanted me to come on, and I said, sure, when? Wednesday, and anyway, his show conflicted with this time slot.
In the afternoon or the morning?
Morning.
The morning. Okay.
And I said, well, Tracy, that's when I do the show with Gerry Kissell. He said, oh. And I said, well, look, I'll be happy to pre-record a show with you if you would like to do that. Well, that was more technical than he wanted to deal with. So he told me he'd have his producer call me. Well, 5 minutes later, she did. And I told her, and I said, look, I told him I'd be happy to do a pre-recorded show, but the show I do every week is conflicting with that time slot. So.
Well, now it's not. So I'll mention that to Torme when I reach out to him.
Yeah.
If you want me to.
Oh, I don't care. Sure.
Plant Watering Citizen has a question for you. Can we sometimes hear more about John Keel, the Mothman, and the West Virginia High Strangeness? I would really like to do an episode just on the Mothman because that shit's whack.
Sure.
I read about it. I've watched documentaries on it. And that situation, it's like, is this alien? Is this a creature? What the fuck is it?
Well, according to Keel, and he and I had long conversations about this. Keel was not a big fan of the idea of extraterrestrial off-world aliens. He believed it was all, in essence, interdimensional. Okay? Now, personally, I always thought, what the hell's the difference? They're from somewhere else, right? If it's real, that means they're alien. It doesn't matter a damn to me whether they're coming in a spaceship from outer space or they're coming through the goddamn wall.
Portal
okay, from another
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I get you on that. It's ridiculous. Some people are just so fucking weird about it. I'm a student of Carl Jung, and I love his writings. But, he absolutely fervently fought against UFOs as a real thing. He said that abductions were manifestations of the id.
Yeah, whatever.
These were dreams and fantasies.
So look, back in the day, and I'm talking about the time frame of back in the day, I believed fervently at that point that it was nuts and bolts from off-world. But as time went along, my thinking evolved quite a bit. Now, I never discarded that because I do believe fervently that that is a component of the overall phenomenon. But I then began thinking interdimensional would explain a lot of things. But there was one more aspect that I ended up thinking could be a part of the puzzle. And that is involved with the end of the last ice age. I am a fervent believer that an astronomical event impacted this planet, which caused the ice sheets to melt, the oceans to rise, basically Earth get turned inside out and upside down. And if there were an advanced civilization on there, that some of them got off world and then ultimately came back later. And for whatever reason, never went back topside, but may in fact be living underground. I think that is highly possible. So that gives you three choices to think about. What could be, in fact, all part of this conundrum, this mystery, this enigma. All right. Off-world, interdimensional, advanced civilization. Now, you may think I'm full of shit. That's your right and privilege. But that's working for me.
Hey, Don.
It's interesting no matter what.
Yeah.
What do you know about the book by Greg Bishop, Project Beta, The Story of Paul Bennewitz, National Security, and the Creation of the Modern UFO Myth?
Yeah, I know a lot about it. I know Greg very well.
Is it worth getting and reading?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I added that to my list.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, Greg interviewed Moore extensively and also Doty extensively. Now, Moore and Doty, of course, are trying to ameliorate their involvement as much as they can, but they're both guilty up to their freaking eyebrows. So take that for what it's worth. Like I said, and I don't want to sound like I'm too goddamn full of myself, but I was there when this crap was going down. UFO Magazine, everybody was in touch with us, everybody. And when I tell you that, you have no idea of what the hell we were doing on a daily basis with that. And there was so much more involved in this overall story that I couldn't even touch on. At that point in time, I created personally a lot of hate and discontent because for several years, I did a series of exposés on some of the bigger charlatans in the field during this time period. People like George Green, people like Bill Cooper, and others, people like Guy Kirkwood, which I'm sure those names today may not even register with you. But at the time, they were making a lot of noise in the field. And I exposed them. Guy Kirkwood, for example, was a guy who for years had been passing himself off as an Air Force interceptor pilot who back in the 50s, the early 50s, up around 53, 54, had been based at an Air Force base here in the West that flew Sabre jets, F-86s, okay, in a special covert pursuit squadron tasked with chasing UFOs, flying saucers. And Tim Good, in his first edition of Above Top Secret, had a picture of Guy Kirkwood okay, in there listing his quote unquote accomplishments. Well, to begin with, Guy Kirkwood was a pseudonym. It wasn't his real name. His original name, his real name, the name that he was born with, was Noel Bryce Cornwall. Okay. He had been a Fuller Brush salesman and an Arthur Murray. He had an Arthur Murray dance studio thing where he was teaching bored housewives how to ballroom dance. Now, oh, this was just another little aspect in it. And somebody put me onto this guy. He had been on a one of those weekly strip shows back in the early 90s with Linda Moulton Howe. Linda Moulton Howe had brought him on this show, listing his accomplishments as an interceptor pilot. Okay. She got egg all over her face. And I had a call from a guy. I got a call from a guy, and he said, "Hey, Don," he said, "do you know about this guy?" And I said, "No, I can't say I do." And then he laid it out for me. And John Keel had written about this bullshit artist back in his book, Disneyland, John Keel, Disneyland of the Gods. So that's another one you can look up, Disneyland of the Gods. So I started doing a research expose on this guy, and it took me back to pre-World War II Italy, okay, with a guy there who got out of fascist Italy, went to South America, I think Brazil, and anyway, I detailed this whole thing out in this expose, and how basically Guy Kirkwood was a lying piece of dog shit. And before it went to press, I called Guy up and I said, "Hey, Guy," because I called him Guy. I said, "Hey, Guy, drop by the house because I am running an article on you, and I never want it to be said that I backstab anybody. You get your ass out here and bring me a copy of your DD-214, okay, with military discharge papers." Turns out he was never even in the armed forces. Never. And I said, if you can show me your DD-214, I won't run this. Well, he came out, didn't have a DD-214, read the article, got pale-faced, got up and walked out the door. That was the last time I talked to him. And that, class, is the end of this lecture series. Next week,
we're going to do the
back
Mothman
at a different time.
Let's talk about John Keel and the Mothman.
I'm always up for more cryptids.
Hell yeah. And that story's fascinating. And I am curious more about, because you knew Keel, so I'd like to hear some of your, stories and ideas about John Keel.
John was a curmudgeon. Let me tell you. You think I'm a curmudgeon?
Yes, you're a curmudgeon, and so am I. And that's why we're friendly. Curmudgeons
we have
each
to
other.
wrap.
Yeah.
I don't want to do rap.
Wrap up
Well,
the show.
country music then. Whatever.
Those sons of bitches.
Ma, I'm doing a show.